Albert Hirschman, after spending time with European development efforts, was sent by the World Bank to Colombia in 1952 to implement a development agenda using formulaic approaches based on the theory of the day, but he ended up with other ideas. His experience of the Marshall Plan approach to European restoration led him to develop several perspectives. The first was an appreciation of market price mechanisms. The second, a corollary skepticism of grand central planning. And third was a wariness of powerful countries imposing structures and policies on weaker countries. While settling into Colombia, he often encountered the statement, "Here in the tropics, we do everything the wrong way around," but soon came to understand that this didn't mean Colombian officials and entrepreneurs thought their development efforts were ineffective. So he ditched the theory he was sent with and decided to observe the Colombians' own patterns of action, seeking hidden rationalities in what development activity was already occurring. Based on these observations of the Colombian development ecosystem, he developed a complexity-oriented theory of economic development. His principal findings were shortages and bottlenecks and other unbalanced growth processes are normal for development. Development depends on calling forth and enlisting resources that are hidden, scattered, or underutilized. And pressures on production caused by inflation and balance of payment deficits induce development activity. And finally, there exist identifiable inducing and mobilizing mechanisms for development. Balanced growth was the order of the day, known as the Big Push theory, where all industrial stages were to be generated or supported at the same time. In contrast, Hirschman advocated for unbalanced growth as the more spontaneous and sustainable process. He also articulated antagonistic growth, where changes in one sector could negatively impact another sector temporarily while adjustments were made, which was the most common in practice. Thus, development consisted of evolving trade-offs between growth and stability. Linkages describe a characteristic sequence of investment decisions occurring in the course of economic development, or specifically in the Colombian context, of increasing industrialization. Each investment decision not only directly supports outputs, but contains impulses that call forth other activities due to these linkages. An existing industrial process, however nascent, can extend both forwards and backwards. Economies with nascent industrialization rely heavily on imports for equipment, machinery, and material inputs. Thus, there is a natural pressure toward producing some of those inputs domestically. The linkage is backward, since the investment motive is applied to production anterior to the existing production, from finished product to material inputs to capital equipment. Pressures for backward linkages include normal entrepreneurial behavior and support from government, who will be interested in less outflow of foreign reserves toward imports and a more integrated industrial structure. This government support usually took the form of tariffs on material imports, which both protected and induced new industrial activity producing those inputs. Backward linkages were successful for late industrializing economies because much of the nascent industrial efforts were of the finishing touches nature, where an unfinished product was imported and was finished domestically. Thus, there was ample opportunity for development of backward linkages. These finishing touches industries typically arose when industrialists, who were themselves importers, found it cheaper to import less finished goods during times of foreign exchange shortages and complete them at home. Therefore, the existence of traders, usually immigrants and foreign firms, were essential for this initial industrialization to occur. There are some challenges to backward linkage development. First, it wasn't uncommon for existing producers to resist upstream import substitution because of concerns regarding the price and quality of local products compared to their known imports. Instead of resisting, existing industries could instead develop for themselves the backward linkages, thereby maintaining control over quality and price. In the late industrializing economies, nascent industry was likely to be held by a small number of families and groups. Thus, when these groups developed their own backward linkages, ownership of industry became increasingly concentrated. Governments would attempt to reduce this concentration by supporting the development of industrial activities outside the control of the original groups, but would then face the above resistance to new producers. Industrialization following backward linkages became known as import substituting industrialization, or ISI. Forward linkages are when finished products become inputs for new products as well as final goods. Thus, the linkages extend toward future production. For example, a company produces good A, which then becomes either a final good or an input for producing good B, which in turn could induce the production of C, which also uses A as an input. The driver for forward linkages are existing producers who seek to expand their markets, so official programs are not so helpful for incentivizing forward linkages unless they were of the nature of stimulating demand. Consumption linkages explain the initial steps of a developing economy's initial industry, as well as the expansion of existing industry. Primary good exports, such as minerals or tree crops, would generate income for households, which would then spend that income on imports until the market was large enough to support the development of domestic production. These substituted imports could then become exports. Global systemic shocks, such as world wars, also provided impulses for substitution, as the market for previously imported goods was already established, but the imports themselves unavailable. The distribution of income is important for consumption linkages. The more egalitarian the distribution, the larger the demand for many typical modern industrial products, and the more likely market size will reach the volumes that warrant domestic production. Remember Engels' law on diminishing returns to consumption with income. The differences in development between the northern and southern United States, as well as many Latin American nations, have been described by failures to trigger consumption linkages because of income distribution unevenness. Domestic income increases also stimulate domestic agricultural production. So while considering only backwards or forwards linkages leads to pro-industrial biases, including considerations of consumption linkages explicitly promotes agricultural investment. Hirschman also recognized the path-dependent and opportunistic aspects of development. An example of this is how to turn inflation, considered a bad, into a driver of development with indirect upsides. Domestic inflation results in an overvalued exchange rate, which makes imports less expensive than domestic goods, and exports more expensive to other countries. Countries then impose import controls to protect domestic markets. Exported primary goods are less susceptible to inflation, thus the import protections for locally produced industrial goods, combined with the differential effects of inflation on export prices for industrial and primary goods, enables an internal wealth transfer from established primary production to new industries, which would have been politically untenable otherwise. Linkages are difficult to measure in practice, thus hard to quantify and operationalize. Hirschman's theory has therefore had more of a descriptive value for understanding development processes. Even so, the observation of pure development processes are difficult because we don't have an example of a contemporary economy industrializing from scratch. Observing modern development trajectories requires disentangling economic development dynamics in the context of various mitigating colonialism power dynamics, where the development goals between the more developed economy may conflict with those of the developing economy.